Hi, I'm Dustin, and this is The Color of Life, Tony Awards Through the Ages. Life doesn't get any better by chance, but by change. This quote from Jim Rohn reflects the message of the research I did for my senior thesis in that, even if progress seems slow, it is always progressing forward. This is especially true of our modern times when, in 2019, Ali Stroker became the first wheelchair-bound performer to win a competitive Tony Award. But this didn't happen overnight, and in fact, has many decades of sweat, grief, and strife behind it. My goal today is to share with you my senior research about diversity in the Tony Awards. I will take you through the Tony Awards from its inception to the present, deconstructing the landmark diversity found in each decade and how it reflects societal trends of that time. I'm credible to give this speech because I have done all the research and drafted a thesis to prepare for this presentation. But all the research I did will not be covered in this speech, but I will effectively hit the main points and highlights in terms of important moments in the Tony Awards history. And I will only highlight the important moments in these three time periods: the 1940s and 50s, the 60s through the 80s, and the 1990s to our modern day. The first period I conducted research in was the earliest history of the Tony Awards, 1947. The first thing about this period that I found in my research that I wanted to share with you today was the very first Tony Awards event. And in my essay I wrote, "The Tony Awards initial ceremony was held in 1947, when the first award for Best Actor in a Leading Role went to Jose Ferrer, a Puerto Rican man. A graph of the 1940s ceremonies, as you can see here, shows that 4% of the total nominees in the 40s were a person of color. According to the American Theater Wing, the rules at the time of the ceremonies were to only honor the agreed-upon best performer, so other performers that were also people of color were not recognized. I wanted to share this with you because it shows, contrary to my initial thoughts, the Tonys recognized and awarded the talents of people of color from its infancy, even though societal trends would sway the demographics in an opposing direction. As I found in my research, there were some interesting stage productions in the 1950s that told stories of diverse populations. For example, as I wrote in my paper, the 50s brought on such hits as Flower Drum Song, South Pacific, The King and I, as well as The Tea House in the August Moon. Only 7% of the total nominees in the 50s were a person of color, mostly coming from the performers in the aforementioned shows. A persistent trend in this era is the casting of white actors in ethnically inappropriate parts, particularly egregious in The King and I. The most respectful portrayal came from Flower Drum Song, whose cast was primarily Asian American. I thought this was important to share because this was perceived as normal at the time, as white performers dominated the art scene. Even though white actors were to perform Asian characters, each show is done a disservice because it reinforced the dominance white performers, directors, and producers had over performers of color. My research showed that the practice of white actors being cast as persons of color in shows persisted late into the 1950s. This quote illustrates the practice. This was the case with West Side Story, premiering in 1957. The 1958 ceremony saw West Side Story and The Music Man vie for the Best Musical Award. This presented a pivotal moment in culture. Voters could either reward a groundbreaking portrayal of class struggle in New York or a musical comedy in the Midwest. The Music Man captured the prize, and what can be synthesized from this case, according to Carol J. Oja, is choosing the safe option, vying not to mobilize the younger modern flavors in favor of safe nostalgic ventures. This is far more complicated than can be done in a paper of this vein, but to voters, it came down to what the Academy of Voters wanted to be representative of not only the best attitudes of that season, but also what was representative of the 50s as a whole. I wanted to include this quote in my speech today because it demonstrates the power struggle between two different trains of thought, sentiment and progress. The vote, being as close as it was, hinted that things were just about to topple. However, on the horizon came the turbulent 1960s, progressive 1970s, and hesitant 1980s. One of the first things I did looking at the 1960s was to look at the acting nominees. The total percentage of people of color in the 1960s nominees is 5%, down from the previous decade 7%, but this is the result of the roster of nominees featuring a consistent 32 performers. A production I wanted to highlight for you today in the 1960s was A Raisin in the Sun. I included a quote in this paper. The 1960 ceremony boasted nominations for A Raisin in the Sun, which was considered a risky business investment, according to an interview with playwright Lorraine Hansberry. White audiences lauded the Negro play for its universalities, implying that, if replaced with white characters, the relationship and drama would have remained intact. Lorraine Hansberry, in turn, agreed, but only partially. They, the characters, are distinctly Negro. I don't think there's anything more universal in the world than man's oppression to man, she said in the same interview. Hansberry's remarks ring true even today. While the play's messages can be fitting for people from all walks of life, the art itself showcases something very pointed for a very specific reason. In order to create the universal, you must pen the specific. The spiritedness of the characters brought primarily white Broadway audiences into the living rooms of black families, showing the inner workings, hardships, joys, and successes of such families. I wanted to share this quote from my paper because this is the first step to integration of people in color in the Tony Awards. This is by exposure. There had been very few shows portraying the everyday lives of African and Asian Americans. This glimpse into their world, showing the menial tasks and domestic situations, was relatable to a white population. Audience identification was integral to the success of plays going forward. The floodgates were open for the 1970s to showcase a 13% margin for people of color. The back-to-back-to-back winners of Raisin, The Wiz, A Chorus Line, and The River Niger for Best Musical and Best Play were monumental in creating a mainstay for African American representation as critical hits and awards season favorites. A production from the 1970s that I'd like to highlight is Sondheim's Pacific Overtures. In my paper, I wrote, another win in the decade is Stephen Sondheim's Pacific Overtures, which, by creator request, is to only feature a large cast of Asian or Asian American performers, mostly men. The score is a blend of Sondheim and Asian tunes, and the characters are presented as people, not just as beings to be made punching bags of. Contemporary reviews of the show were mixed, mostly for its blend of American and Asian styles, with Walter Kerr, reviewer of the New York Times, writing, "The occasion is essentially a dull and immobile one because we are never properly placed in it. The evening is a Japanese artifact with a stamp on the back of it that says, 'Made in America.' Why tell their story if they could do it better?" Pacific Overtures remains one of Sondheim's least produced works due to the specificity of its casting. I thought it was important to include this part from my paper because it shows a case of artists wanting to do justice to a culture that is not their own, but not having the resources available to replicate the power of that material because it is so specific. Pacific Overtures is leaning in the opposite direction. The 1980s would see shows set in specific circumstances and requiring diverse casts. Fences, Dreamgirls, and M. Butterfly premiered in this decade, and in part brought another 13% person of color margin to the awards ceremonies. One production from the 1980s that I included in my essay was Big River. I wrote, a standout in this decade is Big River, a musical adaptation of Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Performer Ron Richardson won a Tony Award for originating the role of the slave Jim. Of his performance, Frank Rich noted that the powerfully voiced Mr. Richardson makes for a majestic Jim, although the slave is timidly and anachronistically boulderized here as an incipient 20th century civil rights activist. Over the course of the story, Jim works his way into Huck's life not only as a companion, but a confidant, father figure, moral compass, and lifelong friend despite their social position. I included this part of the paper to share today because it is important to note that the 1980s and beyond presented the United States with an interesting proposition. How does the country acknowledge its history of racial inequities so society can learn from these situations and grow? The last section of my research focused on more recent productions, some of which were controversial and some of which were groundbreaking. The 1990s saw an increase in the diversity of the nominees, with a 13.5% margin for the decade. The controversy surrounding Miss Saigon was an important turning point in the conversations about diversity in casting. In my paper, I wrote, when Miss Saigon was set to premiere in the United States in 1990, massive uproar was met when Jonathan Pryce, a white British actor, was chosen to play the engineer, an Asian pimp character. Pryce was denied entry into the United States by the Actors Equity Association to recreate the role on American soil. The scandal caused a massive uproar in the theater community, causing many different points of view. From Frank Rich, a Broadway critic, I'm completely sympathetic and argue further that Asian American actors have a particularly raw deal. There are so few opportunities for them compared to other minorities, let alone majorities. But I still feel a director has the right to do what he wants to do. Once the prosthetics and bronzing oil used to immerse the audience into believing Pryce was a Eurasian pimp was scrapped, the show was allowed to open, and resulted in a Tony win for Pryce. I thought this part of my paper was important to include because the situation brought the American theater scene to a crossroads. The United States could either choose to delete or embrace their friends of color and sexuality and portray them in a respectful way, or to not include them at all. The 2000s saw a decrease from the previous decade, with only 10% of the total nominees as a person of color. One of the shows I wrote about from the decade was the musical Hairspray. I wrote, in Hairspray, skin color is treated as a cosmetic issue, writes Alex Plant of the University of Puget Sound. For instance, Tracy defines being different as anyone who's black or Chinese or maybe who needs to lose a few pounds. This is an integral part of the plot of Hairspray and presents a larger issue in terms of where America was at during this point in time. Hairspray gives a double issue, race and appearance. Tracy, an overweight teenager, equates her own struggles of beauty to the struggle of African Americans. It is not recognized as something cultural or identity-based, but merely as what is on the outside that counts. And Tracy, as the white voice of the group, is the one to bring about change. I wanted to include this example for my paper today because in the 2000s there is less of an interest in stories showcasing Black, Asian, or queer people on Broadway, and a greater need to insert white goodness into a history that creates a safe cushion for voters and audiences alike, regardless of actual history, feeling, or progress. What Hairspray is representing could be considered revisionist history with a white savior narrative, something the next example would question. In the 2010s, there is hope. The decade presented itself with the highest percentage of POC nominees yet, with 15%. Nowhere is this more evident than in Hamilton. In my paper, I wrote, Hamilton emerged during a charged time in recent history. The presidency of Donald Trump, whose presidential nomination was announced the same day Hamilton's Tony nominations were announced, these two incidents coincide in one fascinating way: their stance on immigration. Hamilton celebrates immigration, not only in its characters, but in the casting side of things as well. The original cast of Hamilton did not have to be a dominantly person of color company, but the artistic decision to do so opened floodgates previously unheard of. Like a rapper, Hamilton uses words as a weapon, writes Philip Kazanet for Context magazine. He goes on to state that cultural perception of history has shifted from Thomas Jefferson, who Hamilton openly spars with over the course of the show, to Hamilton, whose impoverished upbringing resonates with young white people today. Jefferson, who experienced a privileged childhood, personifies behaviors at odds with today's cultural expectations, owning slaves and clearly profiting from them. It has people asking, how can we root for someone like that? In this day and age, we simply cannot. I thought it was important to include this example from my paper because it truly shows a shift in thinking from previous decades. We can no longer treat a founding father like Thomas Jefferson with the respect he was once revered with because, despite all the good he's recognized for, there is just as much morality in stake in honoring such a man. Further, it goes to show that the revisionist aspect of history is now at play in casting rather than storytelling, and giving actors a chance to show their talent despite the color of their skin. Since Hamilton's groundbreaking cast and Tony wins, other shows have followed suit in subsequent revivals when it comes to race-blind casting. Examples include Sweeney Todd, Into the Woods, Moulin Rouge, and Oklahoma. And in conclusion, today my goal was to share with you some of my research on diversity and the Tony Awards. I took you through the 1940s and 50s, the 60s through the 80s, and the 90s up through the present day. What I learned from this project is that there is still work to be done in terms of research as well as in-practice diversity. The Tony Awards have featured diversity from the beginning in terms of race, but expansion in ability and gender are now needed, as Ali Stoker's 2019 win has proven. I'd like to leave you with this quote from George Bernard Shaw, chosen because it shows the malleable minds make the best future. Progress is impossible without change, and those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. Thank you.